Tonight's speakers are Lindsay Silver and Greg Jellin, and we are happy to have them. Lindsay has been around Code and Supply for a long time, and I think she's spoken at previous Code and Supply events, and we're happy to have her back. Greg is a new Code and Supply speaker, and they work together at the Center for Accessible Technology. Tonight they're going to be speaking on ARIA, specifically learning ARIA through the worst coded form input of all time. And with that, Lindsay, Greg, take us away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Colin. Yeah, I think that's pretty much, that's a great intro. I'll say just a tiny bit more. Both Greg and I have web development backgrounds, and we're both digital accessibility analysts at the Center for Accessible Technology. Today, we're going to be talking about, the worst form input of all time, and learning some ARIA through that. We might have overhyped it a little bit, so you'll get to see that example. But yeah, we're going to be learning about accessible names and ARIA, or accessible rich internet applications, if you don't know the abbreviation. So let me get my screen share going. And also today, it's going to be helpful if you know a little bit about accessibility, but we'll try to explain things when we can. But this is meant to be just like one step above the beginner level accessibility. But I think anyone can follow along even if you don't have that. It's going to be helpful if you know what a screen reader is, and if you know a little bit about web content accessibility guidelines. But if you don't, hopefully you can still follow along. I think you can. So let me share my screen. And Greg, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that?
Well, now I can.
Okay, I just wanted to go, I went back to the 8x8 for a second. So Colin, if you can put in the chat these code pens, anyone can follow along today with the code pens we have here. So yeah, take them, look at them, play with the code. And this is what we're going to be going off of today. So there's 3 or 4 of them that we'll do. So I'm going to hand it to Greg to talk about this first example and part 1 of our accessible name workshop.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay and Colin. One more thing, I don't think I heard it, but if you have questions, go ahead and feel free to raise your hand or just type them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them along the way. We usually do these types of trainings or presentations kind of in dialogue format. So yeah, jump in and be interactive. And then one last thing I really do highly recommend after this, we have a lot of information here. You won't necessarily remember it all, but yeah, going through these examples and testing these examples with a screen reader and using your dev tools to inspect the code, I think might be quite illuminating for you to see how certain things behave. So with that, we'll start with what is an accessible name versus a label? And in this context, thinking from an accessibility perspective, when we say a label, we really mean what is displayed visually. So if you see that hyperlink that says plain text, visually, that you would call that the label. The label is plain text. And when we say accessible name, what we're really talking about is the name that is computed, that is passed on to assistive technology. Primarily, we're thinking in this context about screen readers. So the accessible name is what the screen reader hears. The label is what is visual, and they can be different. In this case, they're the same. You just have plain text as your text in the node there, and that's also the accessible name. That's also the label. And if you can see the second bullet point there under the tips, it says a good rule of thumb is the first rule of ARIA: don't use it if you don't need to. So we're going to go through all these examples of using ARIA labels and various ARIA techniques to enhance or to create a different label than is visually shown, or a different accessible name. But if at all possible, don't use ARIA at all, because chances are, if you don't use it correctly, you're going to cause more problems than you solve. So just be careful when you're using it. And one thing that we'll talk about probably more than once is always, when you do use ARIA, always test with various screen readers, test with a keyboard, etc. Because it doesn't always behave as you would think it does. And different screen readers actually behave differently when encountering ARIA. Before we go on, though, Lindsay, can you quickly, I just want to do a little kind of housekeeping here with how to use the accessibility dev tools.
Sure. So I just did the inspector.
Yeah, so we're in the inspector, and if you go into whatever that little panel is on the right, I don't know what it's technically called, but there's an accessibility tab there. And if you go into this, you can learn a lot about what's happening for accessibility. So you can see there where it says name under computed properties is plain text. So that when they say name in that panel, they're talking about the accessible name, and that's the name that's going to be announced via a screen reader. And then it also will show you things, and we're going to see examples where it shows some of these other things, like what in this case there is no labeled by or aria label or title or anything like that. But if there were, it would show up there. And also you can see that role is going to be kind of critical as we go on. In this case, the role is a link. The role could be a paragraph. It could be a button and many other things. So this is just where you can look. And once you learn how to use the accessibility properties section of the DevTools, it can be really helpful to troubleshoot. Okay.
Okay, great.
Back to you, Lindsay.
All right, so let's go through, and we just have a bunch of examples here, and each example is going to explain something about what we want to teach about accessible naming. So let's talk about ARIA labels. And ARIA labels are not just, like some of you might have heard of aria-label, which is an ARIA attribute you can use. That's not the only ARIA label. So that's just one way of defining an accessible name. So this is an attribute that comes from the ARIA spec. And basically it's going to overwrite anything, the label, the visible label that you've given something. So this button, you see this kind of code a lot. Let's close something, close a modal, and it'll have an X for the button to close it, right? Even my browser has a close button with an X. Like that's our visual meaning for close. However, if you're a screen reader user and you're going through an entire website and you're reading text and then you're reading through a whole page and you get to something called X button, it doesn't sound the same. Somebody could learn this over time that X button means close, but it's really not as intuitive if you hear it. So we really want to give a screen reader user a more polished experience, just in the same way that this X is it's a polished visual indicator, but it just doesn't sound as good. So you want to give it a different accessible name, which is the ARIA label of close, which is going to override the visible label that sighted users can see. So our tip here is that the accessible name is set by the ARIA label, and it differs from the visible X label. So just this is an instance of Greg had shown a place where the accessible name and the label were the same. And this is where it can differ, and you can give different information to someone using assistive technology than somebody who's sighted, something that's rendered to the page. Okay. And I think this example is mine too. So let's talk about another version of an ARIA label, an accessible name. So another way you can do this is with aria-labelledby, another attribute of the ARIA spec. So in this case, I've got a little modal that it's not that pretty, but it's this little square here, and you've got a login and a view your stuff button, and then we've got the code for this this fake little modal dialog I've made. And in this case, we want to give the entire dialog a name, an accessible name. So we've used an aria-labelledby to point to something dialog underscore heading. And where do we see that? It's the ID of this H2 here, this login H2 or heading level 2. So aria-labelledby is different than aria-label. You can't just put in any string text that you want to. It has to point to the ID of another element on the page. So that's a key difference between aria-label and aria-labelledby. They both make accessible names, but they're very different mechanisms to do so. So in aria-labelledby, you always have to point to another existing element on the page. So it's kind of two strategies you can employ, like, do I already have the text I want to use somewhere on the page? Should I point to that element? Or do I need to create my own custom text? I want to put it in a string and just write it out. So two very different strategies. And then another thing to note about this example is that this is a div. So I have a div wrapping my modal. That's kind of what I've created some of my styling around, and that's the container. However, divs are semantically meaningless. That just means that they don't have any meaning or context. Like a heading, we'll say that it's a heading to a screen reader user, but a div will say nothing. It's a generic element. It will not convey anything, and it's really useful for these styling purposes. So typically you can't add ARIA labels or ARIA labeled by or accessible names to things that have no, it's called a generic element. So generic elements include the div, the span, and the paragraph element. You generally cannot add any ARIA labels or ARIA to those things unless they have a role. So this is where we start to get into things that are a bit trickier. And a lot of people don't know this. This is where we see a lot of errors, where people do not know that you can't just put an ARIA attribute on anything. So the only way you can add an ARIA label or an ARIA labeled by to a generic element like a div is to give it a role. So I've given it role equals dialogue in this case, and that changes the div from being a generic meaningless element to being something that has a lot of meaning. It's a dialogue role. So there's a couple other tips and tricks here with this. And as Greg said, you're always going to want to test because the web's too flexible. Like these rules are in place, but they don't always play the way that we think they will. So you always want to test your work with a real screen reader because it's not always going to work the way you hope. So ARIA label and ARIA labeled by will work on interactive HTML elements. So buttons, links, form elements, as well as landmarks. So that's like a main, a banner, or a header, a footer, a side, and image tags. But anything else is up in the air. You're going to have to test it because the spec does not cover that. And it's going to be implemented differently by the browser, implemented differently by the screen reader because it's not specified. So did I miss anything there, Greg?
I don't think you missed anything. The one thing I just want to add is it's not that you can't use them. It's just that they won't be supported by all screens. So you could pop in your ARIA label by. It's just that some screen readers would ignore it. That's the problem. And so if you assume that it's going to be announced without testing, you might be surprised to find out it in fact is not being announced.
Good point.
Yeah.
You can try to use it.
Yeah, you can try. And what's even worse is some screen readers might try to guess what's there. So it actually might work with some screen readers, which is why testing with lots of screen readers is always the best option. So if you're a Mac user and you're only testing with VoiceOver, it may behave differently if you're using JAWS on a PC. So that might not be something you can get around because you might not have access to both types of operating systems, but that's the reality. Cool. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about this example here. There's two interesting things about this example. One is we're trying to reference if you look at the code example where the anchor tag is, it's got an aria labeled by, and it's referencing two different IDs. So one cool thing about aria labeled by is you can reference as many different nodes as you'd like. So typically you would just, like the example Lindsay showed, you would just reference one thing. But in this case, you're actually concatenating multiple elements into one string. So article one link is actually self-referential. So the ID is on this element itself. So the first thing that's going to be announced is whatever the accessible name of this particular element is. In this case, it's read more. So read more is going to be announced, followed by the second reference there, which is referencing the P tag right above that, which is a delightful summer drink to cool you down. So it's going to say read more. Screen readers should say read more, a delightful summer drink to cool you down. Now, if we were to reverse those ARIA labeled by references so that it's referencing that paragraph first, it would just reverse the order that's being announced. So it's pretty powerful because you can use it to reference different things on a screen. Like in this case, something that I didn't mention, but a screen reader user who let's say you have a bunch of these like tiles or cards, and each one of them has a generic sort of read more link, which is very common on the web. It's not very useful if you're blind and you're accessing this and you're listening, and maybe you're moving through 10 different cards or tiles and you just keep hearing read more. Sometimes it can be hard to tell which read more that's for, if it's associated with this article or the next article. So that's why it's really helpful for particularly for blind users, if you can provide more context. So this is kind of providing the context of the paragraph. You could also have chosen to use the heading as your context sort of cue. And the other thing that's going on here is we're referencing aria. Notice the aria hidden equals true that Lindsay's highlighting. So the aria hidden equals true. If I were using and we can do it maybe after I speak, we can have Lindsay do a quick demo on this with JAWS. But if you were to navigate to that paragraph text with your screen reader, it's going to be ignored. So aria hidden equals true actually says hide this from screen readers. And that might be useful if you have something that is supposed to be for a visible user only, where you have some different text for a screen reader user. That's where you might hide whatever the visible text is. But if you reference an aria hidden with an aria labeled by reference, it'll actually make it available to the screen reader. So that's kind of counterintuitive. So I'm going to kind of say that again. So like, even though if I were to navigate to the aria hidden text there straight up with my screen reader, I'm not going to hear it. But if it's referenced by an aria labeled by, it will become available. And we can see more about, can you inspect this real quick? Can you inspect that link?
Yep.
Again, we're going to go back to the accessibility inspector. And here you can see the aria labeled by, it shows the two IDs that are being referenced in the aria labeled by area. And then it should show, right above that where the computed name. So that's the accessible name. I'm sorry, right there. It shows you the entire string there. Read more, delightful. So that's how you know exactly what a screen reader should say if the screen reader adequately supports this, which it should. And then again, you see the role as a link. And you can see, if you go down a little bit, it should show something about that hidden element, or does it? No, it doesn't. Oh, there it is. Article 1 hidden. Oh no, that's just your reference. Actually, if you go to the actual hidden, that should show aria hidden equals true. So that's how when you're troubleshooting something, this is a good place to go to sort of see what's going on. If you see that, oh, this has an aria, like oftentimes when we're troubleshooting, we'll find somebody put an aria hidden equals true on a container that has other elements in it. And that aria hidden equals true might be hiding things from screen readers. That's a common problem we see. And if you don't mind, Lindsay, if it's not too much trouble, could you actually run JAWS on that just so we can all hear what it sounds like?
So JAWS is a quick intro to JAWS. It's one of the most common screen readers out there, but it is a software you have to pay for. It is very commonly used, so a lot of people do end up buying it, but this is a software you have to purchase, and this is one of the best screen readers out there for accessibility purposes. So I will turn it on, and my computer is going to start talking. Can you hear that?
Yep.
Okay.
Part 1: accessible banner region code.
So I'm going to quickly skip down the page. It'd be nice to do another talk about how screen readers work exactly another time, but I'm going to skip through the headings.
No more headings at level 1.
Oops.
What's an code law code example 2C of aria-labelledby referencing a hidden element heading level 3.
Okay. So this is the one we want to hear about. So I'm just going to go through line by line and let's hear what the screen reader has to say.
Article.
Okay, we're in an article.
Heading level 4, making an affogato.
Heading level 4, making an affogato.
Link, read more, a delightful summer drink to cool you down.
So if you're looking at the screen, you'll see that I think the red outline might show if it's screen sharing, but JAWS just skipped the paragraph text, a delightful summer drink to cool you down. It skipped it because we put that aria hidden attribute on it. However, if we listen to that link again.
Heading link, read more, a delightful summer drink to cool you down.
Link, read more, a delightful summer drink to cool you down. So that concatenated aria labeled by text is the accessible name now. So again, accessible name is that it's coming from the aria labeled by, but the visible label is read more.
Awesome. And then there's a question from Sarah. It says, ID is hard to use in some templating frameworks. Are there any ways to use aria labeled? Any other ways to use aria labeled by? There's no other way to use aria labeled by besides referencing IDs. There is some tricky stuff you can do so you can kind of manufacture IDs on the fly. But that gets tricky. And what I would recommend in cases like this is to simply use the ARIA label and just hard code your string into the ARIA label rather than reference other things, which we recommend that a lot in cases
And you
like
could
this.
probably make the string dynamic too, just like if you're using like React or another framework and you're dynamically creating strings, then you could populate the ARIA label in the same way, I believe. Let me
Alert, normal,
turn off JAWS.
JAWS profession, taskbar.
Okay. Anything else about this? Just one other thing to note about this example, that other ways you can hide elements from a screen reader, but still have them, if you want an accessible name, like to use an aria-labelledby and reference a hidden thing. So you could use like what we did here, aria hidden, which is an aria attribute, but you can also use CSS attributes like display none or visibility hidden, or even the HTML hidden attribute. All of those are going to hide it from a screen reader initially, but if you're referencing that element that's hidden with an aria-labelledby, it will still speak it. Can I go on to aria descriptions, Greg?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about labels, and now we just want to spend a moment talking about aria descriptions. Descriptions just provide additional information, just like what you think. So, you know, an aria label is it's providing the label for whatever you're, you know, labeling, and then a description is going to add additional information onto it. So in this case, this is a very common example we see where you've got a checkbox to agree to forms, to terms and conditions, and then a little more information about you cannot complete the form unless you agree to the terms and conditions. It's below that form input. And let's say that popped up after I tried to, you know, complete this form. I tried to submit, and this error message pops up, which I think happens to me a lot. So in this case, I'm using an aria attribute called aria-describedby, because I want to link this descriptive text to my form element in this case. I think this aria-describedby attribute may have even been created for this use case. And of course, it can be used differently, but linking additional text, hint text, error text to a form label is one of the most common ways to use this aria attribute called aria-describedby. So let me just go through this a little bit more and talk about the code. So we've got a label that is, do you agree to the terms and conditions? And that label is linked to the input by this for referencing the ID of the input. That's called explicit input labeling. So we're explicitly saying this label is for this input checkbox. And then on this checkbox, we've got the aria-describedby equals error text terms. So it's just like aria-labelledby. You have to link it to the ID of another element. So the ID on this error text is error text terms. So it's another case where you can't just put any string you want there. Aria-describedby requires that you reference an existing ID of another element on the page. I think that also speaks to kind of like the purpose that it was created for. It's really, if text pops up somewhere that is describing something else, you should reference the ID of that text. An aria-describedby will generally always be announced for a screen reader after the accessible name. So it's always accessible name and then the description. Let's see, what else? Always test with aria-describedby, just like everything else we've been talking about. And I think that's all I want to say about that one. There's a couple other tips here, but I think we've gone over them in the example. Okay.
Yeah, I think you covered that. Great. Okay, so label and name. This is where, so in this case, we have a submit button. The visual text will be submit. As you can see, the button right below the example 4 heading says submit. So if I'm looking at this, I have no idea that there's a hidden name, a hidden accessible name that is called continue. And the problem is if those don't match up it can be problematic for different types of users. So for example, if I'm a voice input user like Dragon Naturally Speaker, so I'm not using my hands, but I'm using voice input to navigate a page, and I say submit button, that's the command I might use to submit that button. It might not work because the button is actually, the accessible name for that button is actually continue. So what I should be saying is continue button, or click continue button, I think is the command. So it doesn't match. So there's a rule in WCAG being the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are the guidelines that we have to follow to make sure websites are accessible. It's also the legal compliance regulation stuff. So it's quite important. The rule is it's 2.53, which is for user interface components with labels that include text or images. So that's, in this case, we have text, the word submit. The name contains the text that is presented visually. So the name ARIA label should also contain the word submit. It should match. It can have the label can have additional information, but it should have at least the word submit. So it could say something like submit to continue, and that would be sufficient.
It'd be nice if this said accessible name just to go with our presentation. That's what they mean there.
Yeah, that is what they mean there. Yeah, it's oftentimes they'll kind of generalize and just call it name, but yeah, when it comes to accessibility, that's always that means the accessible name. Anything else you'd add to clarify that, Lindsay?
Yeah, there's one other example that you normally say with this label and name piece, which is that let's say you're working with your coworker who's blind, and you're telling them how to fill out a form, and you say you go to the submit button. Their screen reader is going to say, I found a continue button. There's no submit button on the page. So it's also kind of a communication barrier, and can imagine instructions becoming very wonky when things are named differently.
Awesome. Thanks for adding that.
Okay, we're going to go on to part 2. Are you going to share your screen for this one, Greg?
No, not
yet. Should we continue? Okay.
Yeah, let's continue. Yeah, we've done this presentation a few times, and we used to share back and forth, but it gets complicated to try to switch back and forth.
It'd be nice if it was a fluid way, to do it. Okay. I think this one's mine. Let me just check. Nope, this is yours.
Okay. So in this case, this is very similar to the very first example, except, yeah, this is an example of this is very common, right? You have your ham nav icon. In this case, it's an SVG, and I think what would be announced, it's something like, have you ever heard this, Lindsay? I think it says something like 3 lines or vertical ellipsis. It says something weird if you come to a ham nav without a label.
I don't know.
So yeah, here we have a visual label that doesn't have any useful information for a screen reader user. So we're just slapping a label on there that says menu. So this is a very common use case. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else to say about that one.
Yeah, this is just emphasizing that the accessible name, which is menu, will differ from the graphic, which is actually the label. In this case, a visual graphic is the label. Okay, great. Let's go back to my Affogato cards example. Anybody else like Affogatos? So we'll talk a little more about how the accessible name can differ from the label with these as well. So, okay, I think I have four examples here of this card component, this clickable card component you see on many different websites. I know mine's not as pretty, but these are everywhere, where you have a card that's got a heading and something that wants you to click through, and you can generally click the whole card. So in this case, we're looking at the read more link in all these circumstances. And kind of like Greg mentioned this before, it's not great for a screen reader user. They can skip around to see what links are on the page. So if I'm just hearing read more link, but it's actually associated with different information every time. It might be making an affogato in one, and I'm reading more about that, or it could be, making a bananas Foster for another card, read more about that. But I'm just hearing read more link. It's just not, there's no context there. So it's very bad practice if you're not giving it some more context than that for the link, because people do skip around link by link. So in this case, we've talked about aria label before, and I'm using an aria label here to give this link more context. So the visible label still says read more, but I've decided I want to follow good practices and give a screen reader user, other assistive technology users, different text, give them more context. So I've assigned an aria label that will override the visible text with read more about making an affogato. Yeah, that one.
I'll just add that kind of like what Sarah's question. I think that's the way you might code to solve the problem. Instead of using aria-labelledby, you could just do it with a label like that.
Good point. Okay, let's look at example number 2. And this is something we haven't seen before. So if we look at the code here, in the link, I have put, still has the read more text, which is the visible label. And then you'll see a span with the class of screen reader only. So this is pretty common. This is a piece of CSS that you can inspect my code for this code pen and check it out, what the CSS is doing. But it basically makes anything I put screen reader only the class on, the CSS is going to make it into a tiny, tiny like pixel, and then it's going to hide it way off screen, and it's only, I think, like 1 pixel by 1 pixel, and it's also hidden in a certain way. It's a hack. That's, if you look up screen reader only CSS, you'll get a lot of results for it, and I recommend the CSS tricks article on it. That's what I normally use. So in this case, I'm hiding some text that could be technically visible, so this is a little tricky, but this text could be visible, but I've hidden it from a cited user with CSS. So in this case, the accessible name is read more about making an affogato. And the cited user is just, I'm hiding some text from them. In this case, I'm not using aria, but the accessible name is different for somebody who's getting the code of this and getting access to the accessible name. So this is also a good strategy for when, this is another strategy for assigning a name, a different accessible name than the visible label. Very commonly used as well. And Greg and I think that this is good. We haven't done enough research to confirm this, but we think this is good for like internationalizing text, because I think that, sometimes we worry that we haven't done enough research, but I'm going to say that the aria attributes sometimes might not get translated. We're not sure. And this text would get translated by most plugins and stuff. So it's a good strategy if you have lots of internationalization on your website. Okay, example number 3 of this. So again, I'll draw our attention to the read more link. It still looks the same visibly, just says read more. And here we're using an aria labeled by. And again, we're concatenating a couple different IDs, because again, aria labeled by, you can only reference other elements on the page and you have to reference their IDs. So I'm referencing the link itself, read more, and I'm referencing article 1 heading ID, which is the ID of the heading, which is making an affogato. So, sequentially it'll say, because it'll say them in order sequentially. So it'll be read more, the first piece of the ID, and then the second ID making an affogato. So not perfect English, but if I was really struggling, I could do this and make the accessible name that way and provide my screen reader user a little more context. But maybe it's not, it's not the best experience. We haven't found the best experience yet of all of these, I think. So I think my last example is what I think is the best experience. And you'll notice that read more link, that pesky read more link is gone. I've deleted it completely, and I've wrapped a link around the heading, which is really, I do that every time I click the stupid heading and then CodePen dies. So I've wrapped the link around the heading in this case, and the heading already has all that context. Every time I'm trying to get my read more link to be more descriptive, I've kind of referenced the heading, or I've said something similar to the heading, and now I'm just really thinking about the content here and making a decision that the read more link is, it's extra fluff, I think, in many cases, and you really do want to link someone to the heading of what you're telling them to read more about. This is another obvious way to say, this is a link to read more about making an affogato, but I'm not putting the text of read more on the screen. And this follows another one of our best practices, which is that we are avoiding using any aria which is one of the first rules of ARIA. So try not to use it if you don't have to, because it always complicates things. Anything else about those examples, Greg, that I missed?
No, that was awesome. That's a lot of material she just covered. So if there are any questions, now's a good time to ask. Feel free to chime in with a question on any of that. Okay.
I'm going to stop sharing, and you can share.
Okay. So now we're finally at the part of the presentation that was the title of the presentation, about the worst possible form. So let's share. Let me know. Oops, I didn't. I'm going to start over. Forgot to share sound because I'm going to be running my screen reader. Okay, hopefully you can see part 3 here. Okay. So this here is the terrible form. Let me actually inspect it. So we would never build a form like this. If you can see here, what we're doing is we have an input. The input is referencing this element up here with an aria labeled by, but it also has a title, placeholder text, and an aria label. Anything else I'm missing? No, I think that's it. So it's got lots of different things that are sort of competing for the accessible name. And so the question we want to ask for you to ponder, and you feel free to put it in chat if you'd like, is what do you think? I'm going to ask you 2 questions. One, what do you think is the actual accessible name? Oops, let me hide this. For those who saw that, I'm sorry. It was giving away a lot of clues. Actually, let me just completely take it off of there. So yeah, let us know what you think the accessible name of this input field is. And also, it's going to be a little bit different as far as what the screen reader announces when I go over this. So let's see, let me go back to this. Did anybody put anything interesting in there? I can't see the chat anymore. I lost it.
No, not yet.
Okay. I'll give you a moment to think about this.
Yeah, so just with all of those attributes, this is the test where you're starting to learn about what might be said by a screen reader for the accessible name. But we also haven't completely taught the order of precedence, but it is there on the screen.
But it's there. Okay, so I'll go on and start explaining a little more, but I just want to give you a chance to at least think about it. Maybe you have an idea of what is the accessible name of this input field. As you can see here, we have the order of precedence. So this is how the accessible name is calculated programmatically, and you can find this in the ARIA spec. I can't remember the exact location of the document, but it basically tells you what the computational precedence is. So believe it or not, potentially counterintuitive it is to me anyway, because I would personally think that the aria label would take the highest precedence. So if you had both a label by and a label, I would have guessed this would be what's the accessible name. But it's actually the aria labeled by is the highest in the hierarchy of precedence, followed by the label, the aria label. We didn't differentiate a form label, but a form label is when you use like the actual. Lindsay briefly mentioned it, but actually, typically with this kind of thing, you would just wrap this in a label tag and have the for attribute point to this input via ID. That's how we would normally build a simple form element like this. So that's what they mean by label. And then placeholder text comes next in line, and then title. So in other words, if I didn't have any of these 3 things, it would default to the placeholder text, which is Dave. That's what would be announced as the accessible name. If I didn't have that, it would go to the title, and that's not last name in this case. So it goes down the line looking for these. And let me go back to the accessibility part here. And you can actually see how the precedence works here. It's got aria labeled by at the very top of the order, and that's what is the accessible name right here. So the accessible name turns out to be what is your first name. Remember, we talked about this is a hidden element. So if I were to navigate directly to this text, it would be ignored. But once I land here on the input field, the screen reader is actually going to announce this. It's no longer hidden when it's referenced. So that would be my accessible name. Let's go back. Where did it go? Oh, I'm on the wrong.
And we might have forgotten to mention this accessibility inspector is in Chrome.
Yes, and there is one in Firefox as well. It works very similarly, at least. But yeah, that's a great point. I'm using Chrome on Windows. It's also on Chrome on the Mac. I'm sure most of you are Mac users. I'm not sure, but I'm assuming that. Let's see. Okay, so let's go back to this. Okay, so our name is, what is your first name? As you can see, it's the aria-labelledby that takes the precedence. It overwrote, that's why this is crossed out. It overwrote the aria label. There was no form label. It overrides the placeholder. It overrides the title. So just to show you, let me just quickly get rid of my aria-labelledby reference here. If I get rid of that, you'll notice now the accessible name is coming from the aria label because it doesn't have a value here. So it's just showing you how that works. And then I'm going to run a screen reader on this to see if it behaves as expected. I'm going to fire up JAWS. Hopefully, if you can't hear it, let me know, or actually let me know.
JAWS for Windows, part 3:access.
Yep.
Hear that, Lindsay? Okay.
Yep.
So I'm just going to simply tab to that form element.
What is your first name? Alert. Normal. Sarah Stork left paren / her right paren. Dismiss flag. Dismiss flag. Chrome. Also. Code pen.
That was, so we heard some things that were going on my computer at the same time I did that. So let's try again because there's other activities happening that interrupted that.
What is your first name? Edit. Dave. Not last name.
Okay. So it announced what is your first name, which is the accessible name. So great.
DevTools.
Then it announced
region.
edit.
Fred. What is your code pen
Dave.
dash part?
Hold on, I do it again.
What is your first name? Edit. Dave. Not last name.
Okay. What is your first name is the accessible name. And then it goes into edit mode because I landed on an input field. And so JAWS went into edit mode, and then it announced Dave, the placeholder. And then it announced the title, not last name. And I just want to point out, if you look at this description, so that's, remember Lindsay talked about ARIA descriptions. There's two ways to get a description. One is from an aria-describedby, which is the example Lindsay showed. The other way is if something gets promoted to a description. In this case, the title tag gets promoted to description. It's just, I can't really explain why that happens. It's just the way it's built, where the title tag, I think, is the only element that will get promoted to a description, to the accessible description, if it exists in conjunction with an accessible name. So that might not make any sense. It's not that critical. Typically, we wouldn't even recommend using a title at all for an input field. So it's not something that you'd run into very often, but it's just an interesting kind of quirk that the title becomes part of it's part of what's announced via the description property, if you will. Let me just do one more time.
What is your first name? Edit. Dave. Not last name.
Okay. So Lindsay, is there anything you would like to add to what I just did? Maybe we can open it up for questions if people have questions about how that worked or why, if it seems counterintuitive or anything like that.
I'll just do like a little summary since, and we did mean to go back to this form input at one point, but I forgot. But just this form input encapsulates everything in our presentation because it shows you that you've learned about accessible names, accessible descriptions. Now you know about order of precedence, you know about visible labels versus the accessible name. So we've got to inspect the code to find the accessible name or test with our screen reader or ideally do both. So this one input, this horribly coded input that you should not create inputs like this, you should really use a nice label, real label element with an input. But this, this bad practice ends up teaching us a lot about ARIA and accessible names. So that's why we named our presentation after it. I think that's mostly the summary I wanted to give about this.
Are there any other questions or any questions?
And you might be noticing that we didn't get through a lot of examples in part 3. We knew that there was probably not going to be enough time, but feel free to look through, the code pen and the code and do some of your own testing on those. Hopefully you have the information from us and can do a little research on your own, but really you can just test it with a screen reader or, use the accessibility inspector in Chrome or Firefox and play around and learn from it, just see what the different outputs are.
Yeah, and I just want to add that Sarah asked another question, or a comment rather, about Chrome's included screen reader. What is it called? Do you remember what it's called, Sarah? I can't remember what it's called. I never use it, but what is it? Chrome.
Is it Chromebox?
Chromevox, that's right. Yeah. So Chromevox is useful if that's all you have access to. It doesn't really work exactly like JAWS or NVDA. So it's actually good to test with that just to see, because sometimes you'll find differences. But I would also add that, so that's great, especially if you're on a Mac, because you can get kind of a different experience than just VoiceOver. But if you're on a PC, I would recommend using NVDA, and their website is NV as in Victor Access. So nancyvictoraccess.org, and that's a free screen reader, and it's a very good screen reader. So that's a great one, because JAWS is very expensive. You can get like discounted licensing, but NVDA is good. Yeah, Chromevox is a good choice to do some alternate testing if you only have access to VoiceOver. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, things to add that we might have not thought of that maybe somebody has thought of? Okay.
I've got one myself. Is there any? Are you aware of any great I think I could call them like in-language frameworks for adding ARIA attributes, like something that's built into ARIA or built into React or Vue that is like almost like a fluent API for adding these things, or do most folks end up adding these ARIA tags in manually as a part of writing out template HTML?
I have not seen anything built into any frameworks. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We work with a lot of React coders, and I've only seen it done with actually coding in your own labels.
I think that's for a reason. So it's like, now that you know all this, is very tempting. Like, oh, I want to use all these like accessible names and ARIA labels, but Greg and I could not. I mean, I know we didn't probably stress this enough in this presentation because we're teaching accessible names in ARIA, but you know, you want to avoid it if you can, because semantic HTML, simple code, simple websites, simple semantic HTML, like I'll just keep saying semantic HTML, just using simple things is the most accessible way. So every time you add an ARIA label or an accessible name to something, I want you to ask yourself, you know, do I have to do this here? Is it the best experience for my screen reader user? Because unfortunately, also in a lot of cases, if you work for a big organization and you're a developer of 100, you know, somebody else might forget to change that ARIA label one day when they update the code, unless your organization's really good about that. So always make sure you have a good reason to use those. And I think that's why those frameworks don't hard code those things in there. And it's also, unfortunately, it still requires like a lot of manual thought and to add in, because otherwise it might get misused.
Cool. Thank you.
I'll just point out that Sarah added another resource, which is the DQ Axe plugin, which is a great tool for helping with accessibility. Like it's an accessibility scanner, basically. It's an awesome tool. Great tool. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that wraps it up, Colin.
Yeah, cool. All right. Thank you very much, folks, for joining us. If you like content like this, I do encourage you to please consider joining Code and Supply and giving us some of your hard-earned money. We like to say that Code and Supply is presented free and without charge, but it is not without cost. So please throw us a little bit of your hard-earned cash, whether you like to do so directly or through merch and showing off your Code and Supply pride. Anything works. Every little bit helps. That's all we've got for you tonight. Thank you very much to Lindsay and Greg for this great talk, and we are looking forward to maybe getting some more great accessibility content from the Center for Accessibility. So thank you very much, and have a good night.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great night.
Bye, all. You can also check out our job board at codeandsupply.co/jobs. This has been a Code and Supply production. Thanks for watching.